This is every single type of USB cable. And in today's episode, we're gonna look at every single one of them. First, we'll talk about what USB even means. Then we'll travel through the entire history of USB connector types and their standards, which have some notoriously confusing names. But don't worry, by the end of this video, it's going to make perfect sense in that beautiful little brain of yours. Trust me. And finally, at the very end of this video, we are going to break down what all 9 USB colors actually mean. And as if that wasn't enough, we're also gonna look at some very rare USB types, some of which I bet you didn't even know were real. This is the only website I could find that sells this USB. So without further ado, let's USB what it's all about. Let's take a closer look. Okay, first things first, what does USB even mean? Well, USB stands for Universal Serial Bus. Seriously, that's what it stands for, Universal Serial Bus. Let's break that down. What does that actually mean? Universal. Well, USB was designed to replace a whole slew of legacy ports. We're talking serial ports, parallel ports, SCSI ports, the list goes on. Serial. Yeah, it's not talking about breakfast cereal that you feed your little gremlin kids. No, this is talking about serial communication. So computer data is sent in these paths, and it's sent in these tiny little trails called bits. So this kind of just looks like a road, but yeah, these tiny things are bits. Now, these can either be sent in a serial stream, which is in one long row, just like this, one at a time, or they can be sent in parallel streams, which is just, like the name implies, a bunch of parallel streams all being sent at once. USB uses serial communication, and that's because it's easier, it's way simpler, it takes less cables, it's more scalable, it can go farther distances, really everything you would want in USB communication. Bus. Now, we're not talking about school bus that takes your little gremlin kids to school. No, we're talking about a computer bus, which takes all your little bits to the device that you're communicating to. Okay, bad analogy, but just think of the bus as the thing that actually carries the data between two devices. Universal Serial Bus. Great! Now that we know what the name's all about, let's go ahead and dive into some history. It all started with USB 1.0 in the year 1996. Now this only had 2 connectors, USB-A and USB-B. Why are there 2? Immediately off to a bad start. This is supposed to be the standard of communication. Why are there 2? Okay, so if you are plugging in a peripheral, like a mouse, into your computer, then you're gonna be using the USB Type A port. But if you're plugging your computer into a peripheral, like a printer, then you would be using the USB Type B port. So Type A is the host receptacle, meaning your host device, like your computer, has a slot for Type A USBs in it. But then Type B is the peripheral receptacle, meaning your peripheral, like a printer, is going to have a Type B port. So really the difference is with Type A, you are giving help to your computer, and with Type B, you are receiving help from your computer. So hopefully that clears things up, but if not, don't worry about it. Now, since USB 1.0 was the very first standard, it kind of sucked. It was brand new, meaning no company supported it at first. All of its drivers were inconsistent. Operating systems didn't even support it, and it had tons of bugs. It was just not very pleasant to use, which is why in 1998, we got USB 1.1. This was an important upgrade. Actually, it had the exact same speed abilities as USB 1.0, which is anywhere between 1.5 megabits a second and 12 megabits per second. Very, very slow by today's standards. But yeah, like I said, the speed itself did not change from USB 1.0. The big change was the bug fixes. Better error handling, more reliable. Basically, the big deal with USB 1.1 is that it made the USB experience so much better. So much so that it helped make USB super popular. After this, everybody started incorporating it, which takes us straight to USB 2.0 in the year 2000. Now, I think at this point, it's a good time for me to clarify something. Even though we're talking about version numbers here, like USB 1.0, 1.1, 2.0, I don't want you to conflate version number, which is really USB standard number, with connector type. For example, this connector, oh wait, that's the wrong one. This connector is called the mini USB, and this came out around the time of the USB 2.0 standard. But this mini USB, this doesn't actually have anything to do with the USB 2.0 standard. They're two totally separate things. So don't try to match the version numbers with the size and shape of the connector itself. Now, the reason I'm explaining it in the way that I am is I think the easiest way to understand USB is to just go through the history of it. Otherwise, things can get kind of confusing, and you'll see why later on. Just had to get that out of the way, but let's move on. So, USB 2.0. First of all, the speed increased a lot, up to 480 megabits per second. Now that is 40 times faster than the very fastest USB 1.0 or 1.1 cables. Amazing. And around this time, they also came out with the mini USBs. So we have the Mini A and the Mini B. And the whole point of these is to fit USB on smaller devices. So like the PlayStation Portable, for instance, used a USB Mini B, which is in fact what I have right here. They actually don't make the USB Mini A anymore. It's deprecated because think about it. The whole point of mini USB is to fit on a smaller device. So why would I need a USB Mini A port on my big ol' hunky computer? Because remember, the point of having a Type A and Type B is having it on either the host or the peripheral. But if you're gonna need a tiny USB in the first place, then it's going to be on a peripheral device, pretty much, right? So because this was never really used, they stopped supporting it. By the way, if you ever looked into the history of USBs or USB connectors, you might have noticed this thing, USB Mini AB. Now, this is real, but it's not a connector, it's a receptacle. And it can take both USB Mini A's and Mini B's, both in the same port. And they made this for the incredibly niche possibility that you could have a device that could be both a host device or peripheral device, depending on the use case. Yeah, this didn't last long either. In fact, USB Mini B didn't last long in general before it was replaced by a even smaller USB, the micro USB. So technically the USB Micro A and USB Micro B. And again, I have the Micro B because the Micro A, they stopped making it. So this thing is both smaller and more durable than the Mini B. And I just realized I forgot to write it down. So we have a Micro A and Micro B. Great. And I always grew up calling this kind of connector an Android charger because Android phones used to use these before they switched to USB-C, which we'll talk about later. But nowadays you mostly find it on older, cheaper electronics. And by the way, in case you're wondering, Apple connectors are actually different. So technically Apple started with these 30-pin dot connectors, which are just really huge. And then they eventually switched to lightning connectors, and I actually have one of those here, which was a really big deal for people at the time. And then extremely recently, from the time this video came out, they switched to USB-C, which we'll again get to later. But the two original Apple chargers, these are technically not part of any USB standard. These are just proprietary Apple technology. So I'm not even gonna write those down. Now there's really only one more thing to say about USB 2.0, and I've already said it like 6 times at this point, but USB 2.0 was the first time you could use USB for charging, which is super handy, especially for smaller devices. Now, real quick, before we move on to USB 3.0, there was one little piece of USB technology that a lot of people forget about. They came out between USB 2.0 and USB 3.0, and it's called wireless USB. Now, this came out in 2005, but this allowed you to transfer data from USB to USB. Perfect. And the way it would work is they'd have these little antenna that did not really look like this, and they could communicate to each other and transfer data across wirelessly. It's such a cool idea. Why did it have to fail? Pretty awesome, but there's not any hardware for this anymore. So at this point, it's just a forgotten relic. But I can't help but feel like this seriously would have changed everything we know about USB had it succeeded. Next up, let's move on to USB 3.0 in 2008. Now, when this released, it was marketed as USB Super Speed, but this name didn't catch on. We'll talk more about that later. It's pretty cursed. But USB 3.0, these USBs could go up to 5 gigabits per second. Another humongous increase. I mean, that's another 10 times faster than USB 2.0 in theory. So the first big new connector was USB-B Super Speed. I guess it'd be USB Type B Super Speed. I didn't write that. It's okay. So this is what this looks like. As you can see, it's pretty similar looking to the normal USB Type B, except the only way they could fit these super fast speeds is if they added this little appendage at the top. I kind of like it, it's pretty cool. And there's another super speed connector. This is the USB Micro B Super Speed. Yeah, look at that funky shape. So in order to fit that super fast USB 3.0 technology on a micro USB, they had to change up the shape on this one a bit too. You can see my connector actually has the letter B on it, which is nice. Yes, they did make a Type A version of this connector. I actually did find this one on the internet, available for purchase. It couldn't get here by the time I had to film this video, but you can buy one. I could only find one website that sold this USB. Now, the best use for a connector like this is on a hard drive. At least it used to be. I feel like nowadays using USB-C would make way more sense. But back in the day, this was a game changer for hard drives. It meant you could get much faster speeds on your hard drives. Actually, this came with my Western Digital hard drive that I bought off Amazon. I guess they haven't exactly updated that model yet to use USB-C. But this was cool for its time. I still like the shape of it and the look of it. I think it's pretty neat. But I forgot to write it down again. Man, I'm bad at this whole writing things down business. So that is the USB Micro B Super Speed. Almost ran out of room, but there it is. Next up, we have the USB 3.1, which came out in the year 2013. And when this released, they tried marketing it as Super Speed Plus, which unfortunately didn't catch on either. We'll talk more about that in 1 second. Some of you guys already know how crazy the naming is about to get. But yeah, this was a great upgrade. USB speeds could go all the way up to 10 gigabits per second. And there is support for the USB Type-C, finally. So let's pull it out. Yes, this guy he's so beautiful. This is the best USB for so many reasons, some of which we'll get into later, but it's reversible. You can put it in whatever direction you want. It also supports very high wattage, meaning you can get super fast charging with this thing. Seriously, if you guys aren't using a USB-C cable for your phone charger, you need to be. Even if it's USB-C to Lightning, that is so much better than USB-A to Lightning. You guys gotta get on this. But USB 3.1, it's a little bit misunderstood, all because of the name. I've been teasing it for a while now. Let's talk about the naming scheme of USB 3.1. So when USB 3.1 came out with the faster 10 gigabit per second standard, they didn't just call it USB 3.1. No. They actually called it USB 3.1 Gen 2. Okay, what's Gen 1? Well, they proceeded to go back to the USB 3.0 and they renamed this one to USB 3.1 Gen 1. Yeah. Oh, and they kept all of 3.1 Gen 1's specs the exact same. Nothing about these changed. Now, this did actually happen, but there's a few very misleading things about it that I want to clear up. First of all, they never ever intended for customers to refer to these as USB 3.1 Gen 1 and USB 3.1 Gen 2. No, they had very, very clear names they wanted customers to use: USB Super Speed and USB Super Speed Plus. But the thing is, a lot of companies didn't follow these naming schemes. They didn't put it on their packaging. And so, of course, customers didn't use these naming schemes either. And they never caught on. But at least we can say that that naming scheme makes way more sense and is really a lot easier to understand. Now, if this doesn't seem that confusing to you, it gets so much worse. I'm gonna move on for now, and then we're gonna come back to this in a minute, and you're gonna see where the real confusion comes in. But let's move on for now. So next up would be the USB 3.2. And this came out in 2017. Now, the big change with this is you can now have speeds up to 20 gigabits per second. But there is a huge caveat here, a big asterisk, because this only works with USB-C. And here's why. So USB-C, one of the reasons that it was so great is because it can utilize 2 lanes of transfer. So remember, we talked about this at the beginning of the video. USBs use something called serial communication. And that means that they are transmitting one little bit at a time in one continuous stream. Well, what's great about USB-C is they can actually run 2 of these streams at the same time, which means you can get double the speed, 20 gigabits per second instead of 10, because see, both of these are running at 10 gigabits a second. So when you add those together, you get 20 gigabits a second. It's great, it's really cool. But this caused probably the most confusing naming scheme. Guys, buckle in. This is where you really have to lock in and pay attention, because this is where things get confusing. So when USB 3.2 came out, they didn't call it USB 3.2. No. So what they did is they went back and they renamed USB 3.0, aka USB 3.1 Gen 1. They renamed that to, of course, USB 3.2 Gen 1 times 1. Okay, so bear with me. I'll explain that in a minute, but let's move on. Then they renamed USB 3.1, also known as USB 3.1 Gen 2. They renamed this one to USB 3.2 Gen 2 times 1. And then, of course, the USB 3.2, they did not call it USB 3.2. They actually called it USB 3.2 Gen 2 times 2. So, the reason they did it in this cursed way is because the first number tells you what generation the USB is. So, way back here, we have generation 1, which means 5 gigabits per second. And then this second number, this tells you how many lanes you have. So of course, on 3.0, we just have support for one single lane. And the same for USB 3.1, that's just what I'm gonna call it. We just have support for one single lane, but this is a generation 2 USB, which means it can go up to 10 gigabits per second, okay? Following with me? And then of course, the USB 3.2, the newest one. This one supports 2 lanes of generation 2 speeds, which is 10 gigabits a second. So 10 gigabits a second times 2 is 20 gigabits per second. So hopefully that makes sense as far as why the names are that way. But the big question is, why did they do this? Why would they rename the previous ones? That seems so much more confusing, especially because There is no super speed naming convention at all for the 3.2. In fact, they realized at this point that the super speed thing, it wasn't working. So they took a whole new approach, which I think is actually a much, much better approach. So again, they never intended the customers to call these cursed names. They never intended the customers to use those. Instead, they wanted to switch to something much simpler. And it's this. You would call this one USB 20 gigabits a second. You would call this one USB 10 gigabits a second. And then you would call this one up here USB 5 gigabits a second. So this is still the naming scheme that they officially recommend you use. So why did things get so cursed? What is this? Why is this something people focus on so much? Why are we even talking about this if that's not the official name? All right, this is where I'm going to clear up a misconception a little bit. Now, really quick, I feel like I've gotten off the rails a little bit here, so I'm gonna make a much cleaner looking document so that this is super crystal clear. Okay, so what I've done here is I've split up the USB naming schemes into 3 columns. So this column on the left, this is unofficial. So these pink ones, 3.0, 3.1, 3.2, these are completely unofficial. These are not the way you should call them according to the people at USB. On this column, we have official for customers. So as you can see, these are the ones I just discussed: USB 5 gigabits per second, USB 10 gigabits per second, and USB 20 gigabits per second. And then over here in red, these names are official for engineers. So why would that be the names for the engineers? Well, let's think about this. Let's say you are an engineer in the year 2017 and you're trying to make a product. In fact, let's say you are trying to make one of my favorite USB peripherals in the entire world, this knob that you can just adjust to be whatever you want it to be. And this uses USB, as you can see. Now, say I'm this engineer and I want to install USB on my knob. What do? Well, of course, I look up the latest USB standard documentation. Well, okay, so obviously, since I'm making a new product, I want to use the newest USB standard that there is. So I look it up and I find USB standard 3.2. And I can see I have 3 options for it. I have USB 3.2 generation 1 that has 1 lane, gives me 5 gigabits per second, or I have, it's over here, right? Or I have USB 3.2 generation 2 that also has 1 lane. I could use that to get 10 gigabits per second, or USB 3.2 generation 2 that has 2 lanes per second. Now there could be a caveat here that this only uses USB-C, but still, you can see that by using this system, no matter which of these USB options I choose, I'm still using the newest version, USB 3.2. And imagine the alternative. If this said USB 3.0, 3.1, and 3.2, then as an engineer, I might be thinking, I don't want to use an outdated version. I'm going to pay extra for the newest possible version that, that's USB-C. It doesn't even support what I need. So really, this naming scheme was put into place to help people that are developing USB products. But it got wildly misconstrued as the official names we're supposed to use for the USB products. No. They were supposed to help people essentially save money and use the correct USB without feeling like they were doing something outdated or wrong. Now, in my opinion, the reason, their biggest mistake here was that they weren't consistent. They kept changing things around. They never stuck to a single naming scheme, and that cursed them. But hopefully that was able to clear up any confusion around USB 3.2. Let's move on to the much cleaner USB 4.0. Which is really actually just called USB 4 in the official documentation, and the official customer name for this would be USB 40 gigabits per second. Yeah, we're getting pretty fast. Now this came out in 2019, And the reason this can get up to 40 gigabits per second is because it utilizes something called Thunderbolt 3. Now, Thunderbolt 3 is essentially a standard used, created by Apple, I believe, that allows for super duper fast speeds on USB-C cables. So if you're gonna buy one that's USB 4, like this one that I have right here, then they're gonna cost a pretty penny. I think this cable was like $60 or something like that. And you can denote it by that little lightning symbol on the front of the cable. But this USB 4, this is where things really get uniform because the only connector supported officially by the newest USB standard is USB-C, and that is it. That is all we are doing anymore, which, so great. You still see some of the older connectors on companies that just don't care, but oh man, I love that so much that we're finally down to one unified connector. And there technically is another version, USB 4 version 2. Again, not the name customers are supposed to use, that's just what the documentation says, but this would be USB 80 gigabits a second. Yeah, we can get really fast with USBs now. And that brings us to current day. Man, there is a lot of beautiful history with the USB, huh? But now it's time to get to the part you have all been waiting for. The colors. What do the colors mean? And if you just jumped ahead here through the timestamp, man, you missed a lot of beautiful USB history. And you're probably gonna be a little bit confused when I explain the colors because you're not gonna know what any of this means. But it's okay, let's get started. So, first of all, white USB. This means your USB is using the very earliest standard, either USB 1.0 or USB 1.1. So if you have a USB and it has white coloration, it is a very slow USB. And it's a little bit less consistent, but you'll see this on the USB Type B connectors as well. Black. Black means you're using USB standard 2.0. Again, this could apply for both the USB Type A side of things and the USB Type B side. And remember, USB 2.0 is 40 times faster minimum to the USB 1.0. So if you ever have to choose between a white USB and a black USB, always pick the black USB, unless blue is an option, because blue stands for USB 3.0 or USB 5 gigabits per second. And this color also applies to the USB super speed that we looked at earlier. Now, all the other colors we're gonna look at, they really just apply to the USB Type A. But yeah, blue is extremely common. You'll see this all over the place to denote USB 5 gigabits per second. That means you've got a pretty solid, fast USB in your hands. Teal blue. Now for USB 3.1 or USB 10 gigabits per second, you might see teal blue. Now, more often than not, you're gonna see this on the receptacle itself, the port, not on the actual connector. Although I have seen that before. Same for red, which denotes a USB Type 3.2 receptacle or USB 20 gigabits per second receptacle. Although I have to be honest, this one doesn't make any sense to me because USB 3.2 only supports USB-C for the 20 gigabit per second connections, which means if you see a light blue USB connector and a red USB connector, if they're both USB Type A, then you are gonna get the exact same speed no matter which one you use. But if you see either of those colors on your computer, those are your fastest USB ports. I'm willing to bet. Yellow. Yellow is another USB Type A receptacle color. And this denotes always on, which means that your computer could be turned off, but this USB port will still be active, meaning you can still charge your devices with it. Green. Green is a color you might see on some Qualcomm quick charge cables, or like I have here is a Razer. Oh, this is actually a Razer mouse, but the cable is not Razer. Let me see if I can find one. Here we go. So this is a Razer USB, and this doesn't actually mean anything. Neither does the Qualcomm Quick Charge really. It's just more for branding purposes. What's cool about the Razer one is that they actually have it on the USB micro B connector as well. Purple. Purple was used by Huawei on their first fast charging technology. Huawei is a Chinese tech company, if you've never heard of them. And they switched that color from purple to orange, which denotes their newer fast charging technology. And those are the big ones, in my opinion, from my research. Now, the big six are gonna be white, black, blue, teal, red, and yellow. Anything other than those is going to be quite a bit less standardized and more about brand, right? So you can have whatever color you want for your brand, but those 6, those are the really special ones, and those 3 other ones I mentioned, those are just some really common examples of brand colors you might see. But let me know what crazy USB colors you have. In fact, let me know what color the closest USB is to you right now. And I'll USB you later. Have a nice day.
Newly awake, tired and lazy, the cute sounds you make while sipping your coffee. I know there's a world outside, but right now it's you and me, just you and me, baby.